Well, hi everyone. I think the broadcast is starting now, but welcome to the first edition of the Summer Speaker Series brought to you by AEI's Academic Programs Department. My name is Luis Perales, and I'm an Academic Programs Associate here at AEI, and I'm really excited to be welcoming Matt Continetti to be speaking about 2020 visions previewing the presidential election. Now, since this is our first Summer Speaker Series, I do want to mention that this is a chance for members of our student network to stay connected with each other and to take a deeper dive into some of the latest scholarship coming out of AEI during the summer months. So we'll be hosting these on Wednesdays at 5:30 Eastern time throughout June, July. So keep an eye on your inbox for future invitations, and be sure to like us on Facebook and Instagram at AEI for Students to check out our full June lineup. And that's the last thing I'll mention, that if you attend 3 or more of our Summer Speaker Series, you'll be automatically entered into a t-shirt giveaway. So we'll be posting that design on Instagram soon, but stay tuned throughout the summer for your chance to win. As far as the format goes, it's going to be pretty straightforward. Matt and I will have a conversation for around 20 minutes, and then I'll turn to your questions. So if you have questions for Matt throughout, please type them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You don't have to wait until the end of the conversation. You can be typing those throughout. But I encourage you to use the upvote feature that will help us decide which questions you want answered. So we'll try to get as many of those done in the last 10 minutes or so of the conversation. And with all that said, I'm really excited to introduce today's guest, Matt Continetti, who is a resident fellow here at AEI, where he focuses on American political thought and history, and is the founding editor of the Washington Free Beacon. So Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Luis, and thank you for everyone out there in the internet for attending.
Yeah, so let's jump right into it. And I want to, we're talking about the presidential election. I want to begin by looking at Joe Biden. And I think one of the things that's interesting about Joe Biden and the Democratic Party as a whole is kind of the wild momentum swing that we've seen from Iowa and New Hampshire, where Biden wasn't a top place finisher by any means, to now where he's the presumptive Democratic nominee. So how do you account for that wild momentum swing? What happened between early mid-February till now?
Well, I think a few factors were involved. The first is an individual, and that's Jim Clyburn, the House Minority Whip, who gave a stirring speech in support of Biden right before the South Carolina primary. And I think really rallied with that speech Biden's core supporters, who included more Black voters. And of course, the electorate, the Democratic electorate in South Carolina, is predominantly African American. So I think that helped. I also think, though it's more subtle, I do believe the coronavirus played some role in Biden's nomination. And that is, I believe there was a flight to safety when the outbreak really started picking up steam. And so all the people who were leery of not only Donald Trump, but Bernie Sanders and what that model of leadership might convey or act in a crisis like the coronavirus, thought twice. And so there was kind of a turn to a more experienced and more reassuring official in the person of Biden. And we have to also remember that throughout the Democratic primary, Democratic voters were telling pollsters that they preferred a candidate who was electable to one who was, say, the most progressive. And that really bore out once the primary hit kind of large states where Democratic voters were more diverse cross-section of the population had a voice. And so while that early sprint of Bernie Sanders was quite something to behold, and while this is a first, it's the first time since 1992 where the loser of both Iowa and New Hampshire nonetheless went on to win the nomination. Joe Biden is the comeback pops, as I like to call him.
Just interesting. Well, I guess something that struck me about what you just said is, I think part of the narrative leading up to the start of the year was, will the Democrats rally around an ambitious progressive in the South, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, or as you mentioned, someone that is a flight to safety or a return to what's normal through a figure like Joe Biden? And, on the one hand, it could seem that, Joe Biden winning a state like Massachusetts and then ended up, being the presumptive Democratic nominee confirms that. On the other hand, it's been kind of interesting to look at the ways that Joe Biden has over the past few weeks signal that he might be even a little bit more open to some being a little bit more progressive than maybe we gave him credit for at the beginning stage of the primary. Things like a more ambitious higher education reform proposal, things like reforms to Title IX, other things we could mention as examples. But I guess on the one hand, how do you begin addressing that question of, are moderates or progressives more appealing to the electorate, more likely to beat Republicans? And on the other hand, where does Joe Biden seem to be leaning?
Well, I think there's no question that at the state level and the federal level, the more moderate Democrat has an advantage over the progressive Democrat. And winning Democratic presidential campaigns tend to emphasize their moderate credentials. Even Barack Obama's campaign in 2008, remember, he was the unifier. He was the man who said that there was no red America, no blue America. He was the candidate of change and of progress, but not he was actually opposed to the mandate, right? The healthcare mandate during the primary campaign. Nonetheless, while the Democrats have to, I think, present a more moderate face in order to win the swing voters, the independent voters, the suburban voters who want to vote Democratic, but just need kind of a permission slip to do so. They have to worry about enthusiasm, and they have to worry about soft support for Biden. And I do think that's something you kind of see in a lot of surveys where actually black voters in a general election context are not giving Biden the numbers that they have given previous winning Democratic nominees. Clearly, the Democratic Party is worried about losing the supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders, who did not show up to vote or voted for Jill Stein in 2016. I think there is a real wariness about Biden among not only the Democratic electorate, but also the Democratic establishment. They're worried that he might not be able to pull this off. And that worry is translating, I think, into his progressive gamble. He has moved to the left on a variety of policies: college, healthcare, the environment. He's always trying to find himself in the center of the Democratic Party, which tends to be the left of the center of the country. And it's a gamble. I do think it's a gamble. However, Biden, and we haven't talked about this so much, but Biden is operating in an environment where he is basically holding all the cards. And so I think he feels he can move to the left in order to shore up that base without losing too much in the center.
Let's talk a little bit about President Trump. I think one of the things that I find interesting is going into 2020, and I'll mention this, I guess, for those listening, that while the summer speaker series is trying to focus on subjects that are not dealing with the coronavirus, it's kind of impossible at this point to talk about the presidential election without mentioning the impact that the coronavirus could have. But I guess, before February, right around the start of the new year, the story of Trump going into 2020 could have been, is Trump delivering a strong economy for the country? That could be seen as the signature achievement of his presidency. Obviously, the situation has changed right now, and it could very well still be in a precarious position by the time we get to November. If that's the case, what's his spin on that? How does he recover from it?
Well, just to kind of set the scene, 2020 is a novel election. You have, in many ways, an unprecedented president. We've never had a president with no prior experience in the military or in government. And we also have an unprecedented situation for a presidential election. You have the pandemic, you have the economic fallout from the pandemic. Now we have this widespread social unrest. So all of these things are converging. What I find fascinating when I look at the surveys is that even though Joe Biden maintains the advantage he has had in every single live voter survey this year, voters still trust Trump more than Biden on the economy. And so, there is a scenario where if the economy does begin to recover in the fall, and Trump is able to play up this contrast between his approach to the economy and, say, the approach of the Biden Democrats, it could help him. However, I have to say this environment is very hostile toward an incumbent. Let's just go through it. The last time we had a situation vaguely resembling this was the presidential election of 1920. Now, an incumbent was not on the ballot in 1920. It was an open election. But the incumbent party lost that election by one of the largest margins in American history. Most American presidents, and especially the ones that win re-election, have had at least one day where they have majority support in the Gallup poll. Donald Trump has never had majority support in the Gallup poll. I went back through some of the unemployment figures. No president has been reelected with double-digit unemployment since 1940, FDR. And then, of course, remember, the vector was down. It wasn't down by much during the New Deal, but it was still down from the time that FDR became president to the time that he died in 1945. When you look at the different differentials of unemployment between when a president enters office and election day 4 years later, no president has been reelected when unemployment is 2 points or more higher than when he became president. And so Donald Trump has set a lot of records. He's set a lot of firsts. I think he's going to have to set more firsts if he wins re-election in November.
I want to read something that you wrote recently, I think, putting all of what you just had into context, and hoping that you could expand a little bit on it. You wrote, "Americans feel more strongly about Trump, either for or against, than about any other candidate since polling began." And then you add, "His supporters give his approval ratings a floor, while his detractors give his ratings a ceiling. There's not a lot of room in between." So there's this interesting thing in which, in spite challenging circumstances, in spite personality flaws, Donald Trump is always going to be, it seems, in contention. Can you, talk a little bit about that and expand on it?
That's right. As I said, he's the first president never to get higher than 50% in the Gallup poll. He also has the most consistent polling of any president ever, and it trades. His approval rating trades within that narrow band that you just mentioned. Let's say this, though. I've been a little bit surprised at the polls coming out evaluating his response to the social unrest surrounding the killing of George Floyd. It is uniformly negative. And it's negative to a degree that you don't really see with Donald Trump. Now, that's not translating in a collapse in his approval rating yet. We do see his disapproval rating spiking. He has the highest disapproval rating of an incumbent in memory. But there's the potential, I think, for that consistency, which I described in the quote you mentioned, to disappear rather fast. I think one lesson for me, anyway, of the past 6 months has been how quickly things can change in not only politics, but in the world. If we had had this webinar in January, I would have been telling you that Donald Trump's biggest danger to his reelection is his personal behavior, because otherwise he was presiding over an amazing economy, a moment of relative peace. He was withdrawing soldiers. He wasn't invading countries. And now we have a situation where this confluence of events, I think, has really shaken people's confidence in his leadership. And that's not just his opposition, which has never had any confidence in his leadership. I think it's also some people in the middle who were thinking that they were going to vote for Donald Trump's reelection, but now, because of the coronavirus, because of what's happening on the streets of America, are having second thoughts.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that social unrest component, especially given the events of the past week and a half or so. I'll just mention also, folks, if you have your questions, please go ahead and type them using the Q&A feature. We have a couple coming in, and we'll get to them after this last question on my end. But one of the parallels that I think people have been talking about in the past couple of days is the ways in which 2020 could be seen as similar to 1968, and the calls to sort of have a law and order election, kind of characterizing what the contest looks like. What do you make of those parallels? I guess on a fundamental level.
I do think that the cleavages, political, racial, generational, cultural, that the country experienced in 1968 have been transposed to the America of 2020. However, I don't know whether that helps Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. We have to remember that Nixon was the challenger in 1968. It was an open race, and in open races, the challenging party is often favored. And so Nixon ran as the candidate of law and order, but he also the law and order appeal was also because Nixon was many things. He was always playing the right, center, and left at the same time. He was also trying to be a candidate of reconciliation. Donald Trump is the incumbent, and he, more than anything else, in my mind, is the issue in the 2020 campaign. At the end of the day, the Democratic argument is, we are not Trump. And that argument might not have been very persuasive up until the last couple of months, because I think a lot of voters in the middle would have said, well, we get it. The tweets, the rallies, the chopper press conferences, that's on our televisions, but at the end of the day, the country is doing well. You can't say that any longer. The country is not doing well. And so I think that makes Donald Trump's position all the more precarious. I'm not saying he's finished. As a friend of mine once wrote, only an idiot would bet against Donald Trump. But I do think that this is a very challenging position he finds himself in, and one that it might be very difficult for him to get out of, absent a remarkable change in the conditions facing our country today.
So I have a couple of other questions, but I want to go ahead and turn to questions from our audience. So John Sabella asks, looking back at the 2016 presidential election, could Americans expect to see Russian interference or influence in the electoral process or on social media?
When we talk about Russian interference, I think the way to think about it is the Russians like to stir up trouble. And so a lot of their social media operations were to inflame polarization and conflict. And I think that's going on right now. I have no reason to doubt that there aren't Russian troll farms fomenting, controversy on social media and misinformation. I think anyone who's looked on Twitter recently will see a lot of different crazy things trending. And there's no doubt in my mind that one of the reasons those crazy things are trending is probably some foreign influence operations. I think it'll be hard for the Russians to change any vote totals. I don't think we're going to see something similar to WikiLeaks. I'm not sure what that could be. But yeah, I do think that not only Russia, China is trying to interfere in our election. I mean, if you look at their response to not only the COVID, but also the debate over Hong Kong, I think they want to affect a situation where someone more friendlier, or at least someone more interested in a rapprochement, comes into office. So it's not just Russia, but there are definitely, I think, foreign powers, foreign adversaries who are interested in influencing the election. The question is, will it make a big difference.
Mhm.
And I think in 2016, the Russian interference made, if anything, a marginal difference. I don't actually think it's the reason that Donald Trump won the election. I think Comey had more of an influence on Donald Trump winning the election than the Russians. But it's certainly a factor.
Thank you. No, I think Chris Healy asked, how, if at all, has Trump's alienation of leadership in key states like Michigan hurt his electoral chances, especially given the chaos of the current moment and Trump's lack of leadership? How perfect does he need to be on the electoral map to win? How can Biden exploit this?
Well, he hasn't helped in Michigan, and there was a very good article, I believe, in the New York Times, might have been Politico, that looked at his handling of the politics of Michigan. And so it has not helped him. If you think about, more interesting actually is Minnesota, because Minnesota and New Hampshire were two target states for the Trump campaign. And so I think his response to the Floyd killing, and I don't actually know which way we'll go, because there, in all these things, when you talk about federal issues revolving around federalism, there are kind of these cross-cutting veins of opinion. There could be voters who think that Governor Walz is responsible for what happened in Minnesota. There could be voters who think that Mayor Fry is responsible for what happened in Minnesota. Or there could be voters that think that, gosh, I was going to vote for Donald Trump because of the economy, but the way that he's handled coronavirus and the George Floyd murder just make it beyond the pale for me. So you don't really know. Mm-hmm. But the question is Trump helping himself. I don't really think he is. I haven't really seen him help himself in the past several months.
So there's a question that's asking about, I guess, the broader trends on an American political discourse. So Daniel Biddell asked, seeing the rise, unlike those in the past, of populism in American political climate, and it's seeming to become the new normal, would you consider this just a moment issue or part of the larger political transition in America? How does the future look in your perspective?
Well, at the onset of the lockdown, I wrote a piece talking about how coronavirus would probably accelerate the right's transition toward a more national populist outlook. And I do think there is signs that has continued. On the other hand, and I also in that piece said, depending on the way things work out, a figure like Nikki Haley, who is a more kind of traditional Republican political economy and kind of emphasizes issues of freedom and personal liberty over the kind of the populists, say Josh Hawley, who were interested in solidarity, anti-monopoly, they could have a second chance. And when you look at the lockdown rebellion, those protests, when you look at kind of the moves in Congress to oppose a phase 4 stimulus bill, remember that's still up in the air. And when you look at the potential of a Biden victory, I actually think we could see revival of a more Tea Party style populism, or kind of a economic freedom, personal liberty populism, than kind of the more solidaristic, traditional conservative populism, nationalistic populism that has been ascendant in recent years. So the right is definitely populist, no question about that. But what is the character of that populism, I think, is up in the air in 2020, and it could go either way.
So this question seems to be doing well with our audience. If Trump is reelected, should we expect semi-permanent damage to the public's confidence in our political system? Is this a new normal for electoral polarization?
Well, I think it depends on the manner in which he is reelected, if he is reelected. I just wrote something today about this, that if you are a young person who's come of age in the last 20 years, you see kind of a discontinuity between kind of voting inputs and electoral outputs. And of course, most recently in 2016, the winner of the popular vote didn't win the election because of the Electoral College. If that were to happen again, which, by the way, has never happened, every president who won, there's only been one president who lost the popular vote, but was elected from the Electoral College, who then won re-election. And that was George W. Bush. And when George W. Bush did that in 2004, he increased his vote total and won both the popular and Electoral College. So it would be unprecedented. Again, that word comes up a lot in conversations about Donald Trump. If he were to win re-election while losing the popular vote. If that were to happen, I think it would cause serious damage to the legitimacy of our constitutional order, and would, it would accelerate efforts to abolish the Electoral College. So it's not so much if Trump wins, it's the manner in which he wins, I think, that would have consequences for kind of the stability and legitimacy of our constitutional order.
So I think we have time for one more question. So I'll go with, it's a two-part question. And I think something that a lot of people wonder about is, whether there's too much of a meaningful difference between the candidates that we have on hand. So the question is, first, do you think people will just vote on personality come November? Or do you think that picking Trump versus Biden will result in any meaningfully different outcomes for our country? Second, how much do you think private sector weighing in on social issues will affect the election?
Okay. I do think that the winner of the election will have an impact on the future of this country. Let's start with the issue that I think helped, in all honesty, Donald Trump win in 2016, and that is the courts. Donald Trump moved very quickly to release his list of judges whom he would nominate to replace the late Antonin Scalia when Scalia died in February of 2016. I think that helped him in the Republican primary, and I even think it helped him in the general election. Biden would nominate liberal judges. That's just a fact. It would just happen. Regulatory policy. One of the achievements, there weren't many achievements of that period of unified Republican government between 2017 and 2019, but one of the achievements was the use of congressional power to revoke some of the more onerous regulations that the Obama administration had imposed in its final years. Well, if Biden were to win, and if the Democrats were to take the Senate, which would be likely, I think, if Biden wins, all of the Trump regulations, which have helped, or deregulations, which have helped economic freedom, religious liberty, and so forth, would be revoked, and more regulations would be imposed. Now, would we feel that in our daily lives? It's hard to say. I think there are plenty of students on campuses who felt the effects of some of the regulations that the Obama administration education department imposed during its time in power. But yes, I do think there would be meaningful differences, some good, some bad, if Joe Biden were to become the president. On the private side, the role of the private sector, most of the money right now is going to Donald Trump, but I'm not sure how much of an effect it will be. Remember, Donald Trump won despite being outspent by quite a large margin in 2016. More important is what voters think of Donald Trump's conduct in office, his performance in office, whether he has met the test of competent and compassionate leadership. And also, if he failed that test, is it worth putting up with his personal idiosyncrasies to achieve the results, the policy results that you would like to see in a second Trump administration? That's the question facing American voters in 2020. And from all the available evidence, polling evidence, historical precedent, one would be led to believe that most voters want to try a different path. But because Trump defied the odds once, people seem to assume that he can do it again. And they may be right. We still have a while before the general election. Who would have thought, as I said 6 months ago, that we would be having this conversation in these circumstances? So we don't really know what the circumstances will be in November 2020. I just hope they're not worse than they are now.
Yeah, and on that note, that's all the time that we have for this conversation. So Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in. We hope you join us again next Wednesday at 5:30 Eastern Time. We'll be speaking with AEI's Brent Orrell on Adam Smith for Our Times. So keep an eye out on your inbox for that invitation tomorrow, and check out our full June lineup on Facebook and Instagram at AEI for Students. And lastly, if you have friends that are in college who are interested in these types of conversations, encourage them to sign up for our student network to receive invitations to the rest of the summer speaker series and learn more about different opportunities that AEI has for students. So thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next week.